All right, I think I'm going to get started just in the interest of time. I might go too fast and be a little short, but hopefully it'll be right close. So thank you so much for joining today. I hope everybody can hear me. I hope everybody can see the screen okay. Maybe just give me a thumbs up or a yes in the chat if everything looks good. Perfect. Thank you so much. Excellent. All right. So welcome to The Trouble with Ransomware. And if you were expecting a talk about ransomware today, I'm going to disappoint you because this talk really isn't about ransomware. It's about all the things that come before that, all the things that we don't necessarily see, and all the things that sort of slide through our network, like a really creepy guy slides into your DMs. Sorry to the creepy guys out there. So what you don't know really can hurt you. And I think that's what we see a lot as an incident responder. When I go to clients, we generally arrive when something's happened that they see that is very, very evident in the environment. And that tends to be ransomware these days. Let's see if I can get the thing to advance. There we go. All right, so me. I'm Shelley Guthriex. I am a manager with the Incident Response Services team at CrowdStrike. I've been at CrowdStrike for about 15 months. And prior to that, I was the managing lead of the customer-facing incident response team at Cisco for 3.5 years. I've been in the industry for about 20 years. Started out right here in Calgary, working downtown, and about 15 of those I've spent in security and incident response. So I've probably met a few of you along my travels. I've seen some stuff. Now, every time I say stuff in this presentation, think about another S word that also, that infers the same meaning, but I'm going to keep it nice and clean today. So I've seen some stuff in my years, and I've maybe seen your stuff because I've seen a lot of stuff. I do have to give credit for that line. It's from a colleague of mine who goes on Twitter by the name of Litmoose. She's amazing. Please follow her if you're on Twitter. And she says that a lot, except she uses the other S word. But we've seen some stuff. As you can tell, I'm a lover of bow ties and dogs, and I'm usually wearing red shoes, but I'm in my house today, so you don't get to see the red shoes. You can find me on Twitter and my blog that I rarely update, but it is there. So today we're going to talk about the stuff that is the precursor to ransomware. What happens in our networks before that happens? And yes, David Wong, I have seen your stuff. I will ask that if you want to ask questions in the chat, absolutely do so. As I get started, I'll probably stop looking at the chat, but I think my moderator, Colleen, is going to maybe let me know if there's a question that needs answering. Other than that, I am available for any questions. You can absolutely DM me after the fact, and I'll try to get to any questions that you have. Okay. So today I am going to talk a little bit about ransomware, but I also want to talk about sort of the adversaries that we're facing these days, some of the evolution of that in the last 2 to 3 years, because it's come leaps and bounds in the last 3 to 5 years, but particularly the last 2 years. And then we're going to talk about big game hunting and what that is. We're going to talk a little bit about some MITRE attack phases and how those are usually seen. I'm hopefully going to tell some stories as we do that. And some recommendations for each of those phases. All right, ransomware. When ransomware started out a few years ago, it was devastating to those individuals that got hit with it, and it usually was those individuals. It was people at home opening up, the zip file from FedEx or from the Revenue Canada. And their own computers and their own pictures were getting hit, and they were being asked for Bitcoin, and they didn't even know what Bitcoin was. But it's becoming increasingly more complex in the last couple of years. We've seen ransomware as a service develop. So we have sort of a parent organization that develops the ransomware, and they sell that, the access to that ransomware to affiliates. Those affiliates then put their own spin on it, maybe have their own ransom note. Maybe using their own ways to get into the network initially, and are more difficult to deal with. So when we are, say, negotiating, when I say we, I mean we as an entire industry are negotiating with ransomware operators. Sometimes we're dealing with the top level folks, and sometimes we're not. So the sophistication level really, really changes depending on who you're talking to. Oops, backwards. Okay. We're also seeing some really interesting custom compiled ransomware for specific targets. I see a lot of organizations' data over the course of a year, and we see some very interesting, common pieces of malware, and then we see some stuff that's really targeted, and that is very interesting in and of itself. Something we've seen since last year, since about the beginning of this year, from about December last year until now, is data extortion. So previously with ransomware, we encrypted your data and you should pay us some money so you can have the keys. And then all of a sudden, one of the threat actors said, we encrypted your data and we want you to pay us to get a decryption key, but we also took some. And if you don't pay us, we're going to make it public. Data shaming is the newest, the hotness, if you will, in the ransomware world. And once one threat actor did it, the other ones thought, this is fantastic. And they all started doing it. It's very rare that they're not doing it from a threat actor perspective. And then obviously branching out, what sort of capabilities? Preventing the use of network communications, for instance. Not allowing the other thing that we've seen, the Defray ransomware, the Defray 997 ransomware, for instance, is looking for ESXi or virtual hosts, or sorry, the actual hosts for virtual machines, and hitting it at that level, which is much more difficult to troubleshoot and to remediate. What's interesting also too is the ransoms are going up. So in 2019, a threat actor that CrowdStrike calls Wizard Spider, who is the perpetrator of the Ryuk or Rook ransomware, however you say it, had collected $100 million US in Bitcoins. It's huge, an absolutely huge industry. But there's so much before that we need to talk about. Because ransomware is bad, but it's not the only thing. So we've all seen the MITRE ATT&CK framework, starting with initial access and working right up through all the different steps to some sort of actions on objectives, whether that be exfiltration, ransomware, some sort of damage to the network, maybe just sitting and waiting and seeing what else comes along. And those first initial steps are where we really don't do well. Most organizations don't do well. And so until we see something really noisy, like I said, the most calls we get are folks with ransomware, because all of a sudden it's available in your network to see. All of a sudden, things that aren't available, like your files, make users sit up and ask, what's going on? And until then, a lot of times we don't see it. We don't understand that there's actually something going on. And there has been for possibly days, weeks, or even months. And the adversaries are fast. So this is probably a slide that's about 2 years old. And so those times have changed a little bit, but I think this is from late 2018. And at CrowdStrike, we use animals to describe some of our adversaries. So bears are Russian or Russian nation state actors. Kolimas are North Korea. Pandas, China. Kittens are Iran, and spiders are cyber criminals. So you'll notice that the spiders are the slowest. But are they anymore? 2 years later, are they anymore? Bears, 18 minutes and 49 seconds was the fastest that we clocked a breakout time. So that's initial access to some sort of action on objective. That's incredibly fast. But generally speaking, nation state actors. Lots of backing, lots of money to be able to do that. So it is probably obvious that that's going to be fast. Spiders, on the other hand, 9 hours, 42 minutes. That seems, well, it might be fast depending on your detection capabilities, but from a scale perspective, that seems mighty slow compared to, say, those bears. But the truth is that ecosystem, it is making it in the ecosystem of cyber criminals, which includes both the nation state adversaries as well as sort of the normal just criminals, if you will, they're evening the playing field a little bit. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. The biggest thing you need to understand is knowing your adversary. So behind all of the cool comics that we have, the fun names, and the malware even, are people who are perpetrating these acts. So we need to understand that, what the intent is, and what your risk profile is from an organizational perspective. You may be opportunistically targeted, or you may be specifically targeted based on your industry, based on data that you hold, based on mergers that you're going to be making, intellectual property that you have, and all those things we have to think about from a risk profile perspective, and then understand perhaps what sort of adversaries might be targeting your organization. I'm going through these slides far too fast. I'm going to have to slow down. All right. So, big game hunting. It is not a picture of the Trump sons standing over the poor body of some creature that they've shot. That is in fact still big game hunting, which is awful. But in this case, what we're talking about is a switch in tactics from the original sort of targeting that we were seeing in ransomware to start with, which was individuals, home users, small businesses. The ransomware actors started to up their game, and I believe it was originally Spider, who is the perpetrators of the BitPaymer malware. They changed their tactics to organizations, large organizations. They saw an opportunity to go for high value, low volume targets. So less organizations targeted, but much more high volume. So they're getting much higher ransoms as it goes forward, being able to ask for more money. The data might be more valuable from a ransomware perspective. And we saw that change in about 2 years ago in what the targeting was. So now we're seeing very large organizations that are being targeted as opposed to individuals at home. I think it's been a while since I've heard of individuals getting hit with ransomware, although it does happen. It is much more likely to happen within a corporate setting these days. Okay, so as I said, there's an ecosystem of cyber criminals, and that includes our nation state actors, our hacker adversaries from the hacktivist communities, et cetera, and so forth. And one of the reasons that there's an ecosystem is they are, they're a business. They're trading information. We see from initial access, for instance, being offered on the dark web. In the last year, I've had a couple of customers that have been notified by 3-letter agencies or 4-letter agencies, depending on where you're from, regarding the fact that access to their environments were being offered for sale by certain threat actors on the dark web. So sometimes they come right out and say, I've got access to X company's information. And sometimes they say, I've got access to a company whose gross income last year was this much, who have this many employees and are in this industry. And you can, generally speaking, get fairly accurate about who that particular target is based on that information. And it's being sold. And the interesting part is it's not that expensive. Gaining access to a network and selling the access for $500, $1,000. It's not expensive to get access to a large company's information if a threat actor has a foothold. And that particular threat actor isn't interested in doing the further steps. All they're interested in doing is what they're good at, which is gaining access in some way. Maybe they have an exploit that they're using on a particular type of vulnerability that's been very lucrative for them. And they're going to do it again and again and again, put all of these systems up or networks up for access for sale. And then they move on. They move on to the next thing. They move on to the next vulnerability that they find. And the next group that buys that and picks that up are the ones that actually try that access, that get in and start looking around. And maybe that organization, that cyber criminal organization, is the one that maybe gains persistence or gains some sort of credentials within the environment. We're seeing that with access via a number of remote systems, Citrix, VPN, RDP, etc. Go in, find some access, find some credentials, and maybe they drop the initial payload and start some initial malware. Like for instance, we were seeing a couple of years ago with Ryuk, we first saw Emotet and TrickBot before we even saw Ryuk. And those were groups that moved through. We did this, now you do this, and we'll sell you access so that you can do this. And so we're seeing those kind of evolution where there's an ecosystem. They're selling and buying information, they're selling and buying credentials, they're selling and buying access to networks. And because there's this business, and it's a big business, there's never, when we're going into an investigation, we're always looking for multiple threat actors likely, because today it's very rare that we're seeing one actor carry out an entire life cycle of an attack. All right. So let's get into some MITRE attack framework phases. Initial access. A partner of ours that we work with quite frequently is Coveware, and they recently released a blog that has just a great amount of information. But one thing that really stuck out to me was the #1 way that cyber criminals are getting into our networks these days is remote desktop protocol, open to the internet. Every time I go into a client for an incident response and they tell me, no, we don't have RDP open to the internet, I would say 90% of the time, they're wrong. Somebody opened up a port to their home workstation. A vendor that they deal with opened up RDP for themselves to make it easier for them to support whatever function they do within the organization. It happens, and it's way more common than we think. If you have Showdown, it's awesome to go in and just look for open RDP and see what's out there, because it's in the millions. It's incredible how many organizations have RDP open and likely don't know about it. I actually worked with an organization several years ago that used RDP as part of their business solution. It was intentional. Unfortunately, it was used against them in a very large ransomware attack. And in that case, again, the threat actor had access to their network, was moving around laterally, was finding what they need, and then finally did their ransomware. We also have users still opening phishing emails. That's not going to change. And unfortunately, that's just one of those things that we deal with as IT security professionals. But the other large one is software vulnerabilities in perimeter devices. And that's been huge over probably the last year. Fortinet, Pulse VPN, Citrix, and others and various and sundries. I can't remember it off the top of the head, but those are the three that stick out to me that I've seen the most. And I'm going to say that I'm going to put out a caveat here and say, I'm not blaming any of those vendors for what's happening with that. This is unpatched systems. This is systems that are way behind in their firmware, or at least behind at the point where there's a vulnerability that a threat actor has been able to take advantage of. So those are still really huge things out in the network. So some recommendations from initial access. I think, and I'm going to be preaching to the choir with probably every and all of these recommendations, but it's amazing to me how much common sense is not common. So multi-factor authentication for all remote access. I can't even say this strongly enough. How many organizations I go to see and I say to them, do you have multi-factor authentication, please? And they go, oh yeah, we do that. Is it for webmail? Well, no, we haven't got to webmail yet. Or do you have it on for everyone? Well, just for the IT admin users. Now, there's inherently something wrong with that statement, because it's usually your IT admin users who are a little bit more careful about their credentials. It's your normal users who are more likely to click on something, be socially engineered, go to a compromised website. Maybe your executive users as well. So not having MFA for the users that are more likely to be taken advantage of seems counterintuitive, but there it is. Patch your stuff. And remember I said that about the stuff word. What I'm really intending is something else, but patch everything. and I talked about those perimeter devices. There's just too many times that I've gone into an organization and said, oh, what are you using? That type of VPN? And what's your firmware? Let's look that up. Oh, look, it's vulnerable. It's been vulnerable since 2017, and it hasn't been updated. And unfortunately, this happens a lot. We say, do you store your logs? No. Okay, well, all the evidence of that exploit has now completely rolled off your system, and I can't tell you what your initial entry vector was. Happens every day. Users will always click on phishes. They absolutely will. But I think there's a few things that we can do. One of those is empower them to report. There tends to be some embarrassment around, I accidentally clicked on that and then something happened, but I didn't want to tell anybody. And then there's just like, I didn't really care, and so I clicked on it anyways. We were working on a case just this week where we couldn't figure out what the initial entry vector was. The customer's employee swore he did not open his personal mail, and there wasn't a problem with, and he didn't open anything from his corporate email either. Well, it turns out a week later, getting into the investigation, he did in fact forward an email from his personal Gmail to his corporate account containing a zip file from someone like FedEx, not the real FedEx. And there they have, the start of infiltration from a threat actor, which ended up being ransomware at the end of the day. So we want to empower those folks to report. One of the ways I used to do it back in the day was actually publicly encourage people and pat them on the back, but also send nice things like $5 gift cards if they actually found a phishing email that was interesting from a malicious actor perspective. If they just sent us spam, they didn't get a gift card. But if they sent us one that was like, ooh, yes, that could have been bad, then you get a $5 gift card from Starbucks. You'd be amazed at how many emails you get. Can be a little unwieldy, but they're taking an interest in how they protect in the organization. I can't say strongly enough, but getting a good email gateway to help you out with these things and ensure that it's catching as much as you possibly can before it gets to your users, and anything that might be going out as well. We're seeing a lot more real and hard to detect phishing. So one organization gets compromised, one user gets compromised, and emails that are sent out from that real user's account by the threat actor to partner businesses, to partner organizations, or to customers, are then infecting those organizations as they move forward. So it is getting more and more difficult to tell, but it's about training our users and empowering them to be more assertive in looking at their email and being critical of what they're seeing. There is no good macro. I will die on that hill. There is no good macro. I don't care what your finance department tells you about the macros that they need in their spreadsheets. There is no good macro. So please disable all and every macro ever. And I'm going to say this probably more than 11 times in this presentation, but everything that we're doing, we need to be monitoring it. We need to be logging, we need to be monitoring all of these things. And if we're not looking, then we've failed before we even started. We can put technology in place. We can have highly trained people. We can have good process around what we're doing. But if we don't actually look at the data that we're collecting, look at the consoles that we have put technology in place for, then it's all useless. We may have not have spent the money. We may have not have trained those people because it doesn't matter. Threat actors, generally speaking, like to work really strange hours. And so if we're not looking between the hours of 6 p.m. and 6 a.m., we're missing stuff. And if your organization is unable to, doesn't have the resources to be doing that 24/7 monitoring, then I highly recommend you look into having somebody else help you out with that. Okay. I'm not going to do every step of the MITRE ATT&CK framework because I simply don't have time for it. But I'm going to try to cover the ones that I think are really important. Once they're in, they're going to do a few things. And one of those is if they come in with a regular user account, they're going to try to escalate their privilege. I think what's interesting for me is that there isn't a really tough way. You know, I mean, gaining privilege is hard, but it also isn't. There's a number of different ways to do it that come down to different types of code, like say Mimikatz, little applications like password dump or WCE, and then just using exploits as well for unpatched systems. One of the things that we see quite often before we see, for instance, Mimikatz being used in an environment, we see this on I bet you almost every customer that we have a malware attack with that Mimikatz was used. We see just before that, there is a registry key called wdigest. If you don't know what it is, I'm not going to go into it today, but highly recommend you look it up. But essentially, it is recommended for legacy operating systems that be enabled. It needs to be a 0, I think, which in modern Windows operating systems, it is. We see time and time again when a threat actor wants to use Mimikatz, that they change that to a 1. And when we see that, we know we're going to see Mimikatz right off the bat, because when you turn it to 1, what it means is that credentials that were not being saved in memory are suddenly being saved in memory again. Legacy operating systems like Windows 2003, like Windows XP, they automatically would just let credentials float around in memory. Once we typed it into the computer, until that machine was rebooted, those credentials were floating around in memory and were accessible to anybody that was able to pull those out. With more modern operating systems, that's been turned off by default, but that's where we see threat actors coming in and changing that key. And then we see Mimikatz executed, say, hours or days later, once they've had the opportunity to collect some more credentials. Now, if a user account with administrative privilege logs in during that time, then they're able to grab those out of memory and use those, whether it's a local admin account or whether it's a domain admin account, and then game over right there. But if it's a local admin account, we're seeing far too many users that, one, have local admin on their desktops, but two, local admins that are shared across the internet. So if we have a desktop local admin password, for instance, that is shared across your entire enterprise for all of your desktops, it's the same local admin password. Well, guess what? Once they have one, they can move laterally very, very easily. The other thing that we see quite a bit, we do compromise assessments. And one of the things we specifically look for is files that have password in the name, or pass. And let's face it, our users are terrible at letting passwords just sit around in files, because it's easier that way, right? If I write it down, then I won't forget it. But the last one I think is the most interesting, which is when we have people move from job to job, when we do mergers, when we move people from OU to group to group, they gain privilege in ways that is unexpected. And so when we look immediately at a particular user, we say, well, that user should be absolutely fine. They're only in this group, and that group doesn't have admin privileges. Well, maybe it doesn't have admin privileges on this system, but maybe that group or that user got added to another group on a different computer that does have admin privileges. So when that threat actor moves laterally, they gain that access. And then they're able to then privilege escalate farther than that. So those are some recommendations. Number 1, please remove local admin privilege as far and wide as you possibly can. And number 2 is use Microsoft Labs. If you have shared local admin passwords across your enterprise, you're just making it easier for the threat actor to actually move laterally very, very easily. And I'm going to talk about lateral movement a little bit longer, but it's trivial for them to be able to do that. And then audit paths to admin privilege. We started doing this year as part of a lot of IR engagements, where we wanted to understand how easy it would have been for the threat actor to privilege escalate. Using a tool called Bloodhound, or Sharphound is the actual executable that we run, I think. And it collects data about what the paths to admin privilege might be, and kind of draws you a really nice map, actually. It's reasonably easy to use. You can do it fairly cheaply inside. Basically download it, set it up, and away you go. And it's a very interesting map to look at, to understand that there may be ways to administrative privilege that you hadn't intended, because, like I said, cleanup hadn't been done. Groups were out there that weren't intended to be in certain groups, etc. We had a customer the other day where the guest account was in the administrator group on more than half of their workstations. Now, not disabled and in an administrator group. Those are some best practice things that I think made me roll my eyes, but it happens. And sometimes it's an error, sometimes it's just legacy. We want to make sure that that kind of thing doesn't happen. I can't stress this more, but default logging isn't enough. On workstations, particularly with legacy operating systems, anything older than Windows 10, PowerShell logging isn't turned on by default. We want to make sure that we're logging as much as we can, transaction, module, and I'm forgetting one, script block logging. We want to make sure that all of those things are on so that we're having as much visibility as we can on what's happening in our endpoints. Not all of us have the luxury, and I've got endpoint detection and response tooling on there as a recommendation. But not every organization has the resources to be able to deploy an EDR product, and I get that. So do other things to set yourself up for success that you can do for low or no cost, which is, for instance, throwing out a GPO there across the enterprise to turn on the PowerShell logging. Install Sysmon and configure it to capture more information for you. The more information, the better. If we can understand what's going on. And even if you're not sending those logs, for instance, if you install Sysmon and configure it for every system in your environment, even if you're not collecting and centralizing all of those logs, they're there and should be there for at least a certain time period. You want to obviously play with the size of the files on your endpoints to make sure that you're getting as much data as you might need. Without causing any issues from a disk space perspective. But if you're not, even if you're not picking those up and centralizing them somewhere, you'll at least have something to look at. And you'll notice I'm going to talk about monitoring again. We're doing this logging because we're doing it, right? But we want to make sure that we're looking at those logs. So how do we do that? How do we set that up? Again, 24/7 monitoring, optimal. If we can't do that, let's figure out a regular time that we're looking at logs, that we have a process that's in place to make sure that at least we're looking for patterns of behavior within our environment that don't make sense. Okay, next one that I'm going to talk about is discovery. And this kind of encompasses a lot. Discovery, or let's face it, reconnaissance. I love this little character. This is an explorer because that's what our threat actors do. They're exploring your network. I like to say this a lot, but networks are very often like the best cookie, which is crispy on the outside and soft and gooey on the inside. Great for cookies, not so great for networks. All of us have firewalls. That's pretty much ubiquitous these days. Everybody's got a firewall. Lots of people have IPS or IDS. Awesome. Might even have some web application firewalls. Excellent. But do we have that type of visibility on the inside of our network? And the truth is, likely not.
Hey, Shelley, it's Colleen.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Just before you move on to this, Adam had a question asking, do you think we should be logging and monitoring things?
Yes, absolutely. That's an excellent question. Logging and monitoring, right? So logging is great. We need that information. We need to collect it. It will at least need to have it there on our endpoints if we need it. But again, if you're not looking at it, you're missing that detail. You're not giving your opportunity to, unless all you're keeping it for is for the inevitability when you do have an incident. If we're looking every day, we're going to detect something. If we're only looking when we have an incident, then we're looking retrospectively. That's good. And in fact, I'm always grateful when we go to help an organization and they have logs. But usually by the time I get there, something bad has already happened. So if you're looking every day, if you're doing that monitoring, if you've set up a process by which you're looking for unusual behavior, absolutely. So great question, Adam. Okay. So
just to be clear,
yes,
Shelley, he was just being a smart aleck.
Mm-hmm. Of course he was, but it's still a great question. Okay. So let's imagine that our network is in fact kind of gooey on the inside. A threat actor is going to easily figure out what's going on in your network, and you're not going to see it. And here's why. The tools aren't stealth. They're making lots of noise. We have native tools, unfortunately, that make it harder for us to see them because they hide in all the noise of everything else going on in our network. So PowerShell, any of the local tools like ARP, ipconfig, who am I, any of the net tools, net.exe. You can do a huge amount of discovery just using tools that are already there, living off the land, right? And also bring your own tool. We see, just in a case I worked recently, we saw a threat actor bring an entire suite of look like homegrown tools, bash scripts, etc., to do reconnaissance across the network. They're part of our collection now. That's fantastic. We appreciate that. But they'll bring their own. But again, they're not quiet. And the output, we usually see thousands, hundreds, if not thousands of output files as they're running these across networks. And they just leave them there. They're not hiding them. They're still there. And then we have commercial tools, right? So we see the use of things like Nmap and Advanced Port Scanner. Angry IP Scanner is always a favorite. NetScan. Just tons of things, and they bring in their own, or they're using the one that you have. It's always nice when you leave them a good tool to use. And they're not quiet, but we're not seeing them because we're not looking. So some discovery recommendations. One, understanding what normal is, and I think this applies to pretty much every phase. Understanding what normal is key. We want to look for patterns of behavior in our network that don't make sense, that make it look like there's a threat actor actually looking around our network. So for instance, network traffic. If we understand what normally is connecting to what, we can look for patterns that don't make sense. Why is this system connecting to this system? And why is there a connection from a country that we don't do business with? All of those things. So not only north-south across our firewall, but also east-west across the inside of our networks. How about user behavior? Why is this one user suddenly connecting to 80 machines that they normally would not do? That's always an interesting data point. And how about what commands are being or processes are being run on our endpoints? So 4688 is the event ID that is for sort of normal process creation. And if you have sysmon installed on endpoints, it's event ID number 1 and has a whole lot more information than just the 4688. So I highly recommend it. And if we aren't looking for that process creation, then we're not seeing, again, those living off the land items that threat actors use over and over again. Is it normal, for instance, for your sysadmins to be using some of those tools? And that's a really interesting question to ask. And we go in and we see, well, hey, we saw this on your network. And they go, oh, no, our sysadmins use PowerShell to do that. Go, oh, okay. And I was actually just using a case the other day where we saw a bunch of really unusual looking PowerShell commands, but it turned out that was normal. And they were actually able to tell us that reasonably quickly because they understood what was normal in their network. They were very, very quick to be able to say, nope, that's something that we do on a regular basis to enumerate this. Great. But when we don't know that, we could spend days chasing our tails and the investigation going nowhere because it's something that a sysadmin that's on vacation has set up, but nobody knew about it, and it's running all over the place, causing noise, and maybe diverting our attention from what's really going on. What's authorized on your network? How many, and I'm going to virtually have you put up your hands, you don't necessarily have to do it in the chat. How many of you know exactly what remote admin or remote access tools are running on your network? Because I would guarantee you that the number is really low. We see time and time again organizations that have remote access or remote admin tools running on their network that are legitimate tools, even not even tools that you consider malicious in any shape or fashion. Simply that are there that should not be there. Log me in that isn't there when GoToMeeting is your corporate tool, or Back in the day, we saw some PC Anywhere. We see TeamViewer, Dameware all the time. We say, is this normal on your network? And they go, oh, geez, I don't think so. Well, we do have some vendors that I'm not sure what they use. And then there's that vendor that's using RDP that you didn't know about, but that's a whole other thing. So if you're not looking, again, you're missing out. You're missing out on all these things that are happening on your network. And that's another really, stealth way of me saying you should be monitoring these things. You should be looking for these things. NetFlow is amazing. I went through many years as a security admin where I'd say to my network administrators, and apologies to the network administrators out there, but I'd say, I really want to collect NetFlow off these devices. And they'd go, oh no, we couldn't possibly do that because that device will fall over if we start trying to collect NetFlow off of it. And to me, the answer to that question is we're not architecting our networks properly to be able to get the information that we need. Because NetFlow isn't just a really cool thing for security people. It's also a pretty cool thing for network people as well. We should be able to use that information. And the reason that the tool is there is so we can get that information and use that to the betterment of our network, to the betterment of our security posture. So NetFlow, get your folks to be doing it, collecting it. It's small, it can be compressed, it can be put on a server so that you can look at it later, or you can create a process for looking at it daily, weekly. We need to be logging and monitoring user behavior events. What are they accessing? What have they logged into? And looking at that data on a regular basis. And that process execution data, again, I highly recommend setting up sysmon so you're getting that much more context around some of those process executions. If you're not collecting it into a centralized store for all of your systems, which is a lot, understand what your critical assets are, whether those are your domain controllers, your Exchange servers, or whether those are your applications, databases, critical crown jewel servers, and put those somewhere. Understand what that smaller subset is and put those somewhere and be looking at those on a regular basis. And how about blocking unauthorized binaries? If you're not expecting a tool to be used on your network, let's make sure that we're not allowing it to be used. If TeamViewer is your remote admin tool of choice, then log me in should not be allowed in any shape, form, or fashion. And of course, EDR is nice if you got it. But all of these things, there are other things that we can do for lower or no cost that will help us out from that visibility perspective. All right, lateral movement. Should not be like Fred Astaire. What I mean by that is threat actors should not be able to dance like Fred Astaire, lightly, beautifully, with grace across your network. It should be like me dancing. I'm not going to do it, but my wife will tell you I shouldn't. It's not easy, it's not pretty to look at, and I really should just sit down. Why do we make this easy for threat actors? We have big, flat networks. I don't know how many organizations I've talked to where you would think from their size or from the things that they're doing that they should have segmentation in place. And they go, well, no, it's just a big flat network. We've got our control systems over here so that our admins can easily get to those from their desktops. And we want to do a little face palm with that, right? Or alternatively, I've said to organizations, do you have network segmentation in place? And they go, oh yeah, we have some VLANs. Our users are over here, our servers are over here. Do you have access control lists in place to make sure that those users can't get into this VLAN or this VLAN? Well, no, we just put them there. Well, that's not helping anybody. Unpatched systems are obviously one of the best ways to move laterally, because if they're unpatched, that means they've got lots of vulnerabilities, and a threat actor is easily able to move laterally from system to system using, for instance, the shadow broker's Eternal Blue. It's still out there, we still see it, and it's not patched. And of course, local admin. I've talked about it already, I'm not going to belabor the point, but it's everywhere. No restrictions on system access. Should certain systems be able to contact certain systems? And the answer usually is no, it just hasn't been actioned. So some recommendations. I think it's obvious. Network segmentation with access control. Put different things that don't need to talk to each other in different parts of your network. Not only is that more efficient, but when a threat actor tries to move laterally in your environment and infect, say, this section over here, they're not able to get to your crown jewels over here, or they're not able to get past your DMZ into your user network, because That's not allowed. That hasn't been, you know, that's been blocked off, and you're logging the heck out of it. Patch your stuff. I have dealt with more than one client in the last year who has more than one Windows 2000, Windows 2003 boxes still sitting in their environment. When I say more than one, it's a large number. They cannot patch those boxes, obviously. So the recommendation is figure out how to protect them then. Segment them off. Put jump hosts around them. Do something to ensure that they are protected, because generally speaking, the reason that those 2000 boxes are still around is because they're running something incredibly critical to the environment. So let's treat it that way, and let's make sure that threat actors can't get to them. Here's the good news. I have yet to see a 2000 box get infected with ransomware because I don't think it'll run on there, but prove me wrong. We want to remove local admin privilege wherever we find it. And obviously, again, using laps, and note that's a duplicate recommendation, but it just fits everywhere. And how about actively managing admin privilege? So we want to make sure that the admin privilege that's available in our environment is understood, that we're actively looking at how it's being used, and that we're removing it when it shouldn't be there. We did a where we discovered a admin account had been active. When I say active, it had been created for about 3 months and had never been logged into. So it's just sitting there waiting for a threat actor to discover it and use it, just because it's a legitimate account. And I think the last thing that I think that doesn't get as much press as it should is host firewalls. We don't turn host firewalls on in general on desktops inside the environment, because why would we? Why would we need a firewall inside the environment? And for laptops, frequently we have a GPO that says, once it's outside the corporate walls, you can use the firewall. But inside, don't worry about it. We don't need it. But what a great way to make sure that systems that shouldn't be connecting to other systems can't. On what protocols? Should your workstations be able to connect to each other via SMB? Probably not. And what systems should be able to hit the DCs? We can use our host firewalls on the DCs to limit the ability of certain IPs to hit those systems. For instance, our critical assets, we can do the same thing. Let's stack those defenses on top of the network segmentation together and provide a much better way for us to understand and block what's going on in our network. But last, we need to be looking for it, right? All of those things that we put in place, we need to be monitoring for them. We need to be looking for them, or else we're not going to see it. I run it at a time here. All right, data exfiltration. What left my network? If you didn't see by now, you're probably not going to. And this is literally the hardest thing to tell. Every time I go into a client's organization, they ask me, was data accessed, staged, and exfiltrated? And the answer frequently is, I don't know. And that's not because we're not good at what we do. We're excellent at what we do. It's because it is one of the hardest things to prove. The best thing to have is full PCAP. How often does that happen? 1 out of 100. Full PCAP is unheard of. Even large organizations really aren't doing it. Would I love them to do it? Yes. Is the storage unwieldy? Absolutely. And expensive, right? A nicely well-configured DLP. Notice I said well-configured because that's a big thing. Again, DLP, it's expensive. It needs to be well-configured. It's a tough thing. So those two things, very, very difficult. NetFlow is great, though. It might not tell us exactly what left the environment, but it's going to tell us how much and where it went from an IP perspective. So let's get on that train. And we need to understand what normal looks like, not only from a northwest perspective or north-south perspective, but east-west. What should be talking to what normally talks to what, and if there's a spike in that, then we can see that right away. How about enabling file auditing to find out what's accessing what, particularly under critical assets? If you've got critical intellectual property, you might want to know what files were accessed on that system, and be monitoring that information from the NetFlow to the event logs to that PCAP if you have it. Nice if you have it. PCAP if it didn't happen. Please be monitoring that. All right, I think I'm right on time, which is awesome. I had to throw in a picture of my dog. This is Ruby in her Halloween costume. I thank you all for joining me today. I'm always thrilled to speak at B-Sides events, particularly in Calgary. I'm going to stick around on chat if anybody wants to ask any questions, but I thank you very much for your time, and I hope you're having a great time at B-Sides.
And Shelley, there was one question about any resources you can recommend that cover well-configured DLP.
Well-configured DLP. I don't know that I do. It's not a technology that I see very often, believe it or not, out in the wild. So I'm going to say, if you do have DLP, please contact your vendor support. There are some experts out there. I am not one of them.